sun was high, burning down on the dusty roads of LaBelle, Florida, as if it didn't care that it was Christmas Eve. There were no carolers here, no wreaths on the doors of the faded trailers scattered like broken toys across the park. A couple of kids ran, kicking at the gravel, but their laughter faded before it reached me. It wasn't a bad place, not really. It was just empty. I sat on the steps of my trailer, sipping cheap coffee from a chipped mug and watching the world go by without me. My neighbor, old Mrs. Gonzalez, waddled out with her two scrawny dogs. She nodded at me, and I nodded back. It was the same every day. A nod, a moment of shared existence, and then nothing. I wanted more. God, I wanted more. I'd tried. I really had. Odd jobs here and there, mowing lawns, fixing fences, helping people move their junk. But it was never enough. LaBelle wasn't exactly bursting with opportunities, and my resume was more a string of failures than a testament to perseverance. "You're a smart kid," people used to say when I was younger. Well, here I was, 26, broke, and stuck. The worst part was the season. Christmas wasn't supposed to feel like this, hot and sticky, with mosquitoes buzzing in the still air. My trailer had a tiny fake tree I'd picked up from the dollar store, but its crooked branches and missing ornaments only made me feel worse. I'd thrown a strand of lights around it, but they didn't work. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the sun-warmed metal. Memories floated up, unbidden. That day, 13 years before. I'd been a scrawny, awkward kid who rarely went outside to play. But one Christmas Eve, I was forced out and didn't have a choice. I figured out how to entertain myself and was running from nothing in particular. I tripped over a root, fell flat on my face, and then nothing. Just a flash of cold so sharp it felt like I'd been plunged into another world. I didn't even have the clothes on my back. Wherever I was, it wasn't LaBelle anymore. The air smelled clean, and the ground was covered in snow. I remember my complete exposure caused me to shiver so hard my teeth ached. And then there was a boy. I didn't even know his name then. All I knew was that he spoke softly, his hands steady as he quickly pulled me into the warmth of his home. It had to have been real. But what kind of real was it? And why hadn't I ever found that portal again? I opened my eyes and stared out at the horizon. The thought had been creeping up on me for weeks, but it hit full force now. I couldn't stay here. Not another Christmas, not like this. If the portal had appeared once, it could appear again. The thought was ridiculous, unrealistic. I was chasing a memory, not a person, but it didn't stop me from standing up, dumping my coffee in the dirt, and grabbing my keys. The old oak tree where it happened wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk down the highway, though I hadn't been there in years. As I walked, the sun beat down, relentless and bright, but the closer I got, the colder I felt. Not physically, I was still sweating in the heat, but something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years, was stirring. When I reached the tree, it looked the same. Its roots tangled into the earth like veins, its branches gnarled and heavy with Spanish moss. For a moment, I stood there, feeling like a fool. I'd given up everything. A whole day I could have spent pretending life was fine, to come here and hope for, what? A miracle? And then it happened. A shimmer, faint and almost imperceptible, danced in the air. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but it didn't go away. It grew stronger, forming a ripple that distorted the space around it. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't crazy. It was real. Without thinking, I stepped forward. The heat of Florida vanished, replaced by something sharp and icy. I wasn't ready for what came next, but I stepped through anyway. The cold hit me like a punch to the chest, stealing my breath and biting at my skin. I stumbled, my bare feet sinking into snow so frigid it burned. The bright sun of Florida was gone, replaced by a gray, overcast sky that pressed down on an endless expanse of white. I looked around, disoriented. The air smelled sharp, clean, and wild, like nothing I'd ever known in LaBelle. It was exactly how I remembered it. The first time this had happened, I was too young to understand what was going on. Now, at 26, I still didn't. But I knew this place was real. I've been here before. And somehow, I was here again. My breath came out in clouds, each exhale more desperate than the last as the cold began to seep into my bones. I was naked. Of course I was. Whatever this portal was, it seemed to have a rule. You didn't bring anything with you. The icy wind clawed at my skin, and I hugged myself, trying to stay warm. I turned in circles, squinting against the glare of the snow. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of my own panicked breathing and the crunch of snow beneath my feet. But then, from out of nowhere, he was there. Relief flooded me, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something deeper. I knew him. I recognized the way he moved, the steady rhythm of his swing, the surety in his stance. It was the little boy, now a grown man. His hands hovered over my shoulders, his face a mix of disbelief and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, like he didn't quite believe it. "Yes," I said, shivering so hard the words barely made it out. Without another word, he shrugged off his thick coat and wrapped it around me. The warmth was immediate, but it wasn't just the coat. It was him. His hands steadying me, his eyes locking onto mine, his presence anchoring me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know," I admitted. "I had to see if this was real, if you were real. Do you know who I am?" He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he pulled me into his arms. It wasn't a tentative hug, not a polite embrace. It was fierce, like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. "You're freezing," he said, his breath warm against my ear. "Come on, let's get you inside." He led me toward a small cabin. The snow was falling harder now, the wind picking up and stinging my face. I stumbled a few times, but he was there, steady and unyielding, his arm around my shoulders. When we reached the cabin, he ushered me inside, closing the door firmly behind us. I waited for several minutes and watched as he built and started an old-school fire in the old fireplace. The warmth hit me like a wave, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting a golden glow over the room. It was small, cozy, with rough-hewn furniture and the smell of pine hanging in the air. "Sit," he said, guiding me to a chair by the fire. He grabbed a blanket from a nearby couch and wrapped it around my legs before crouching in front of me. His hands found mine, rubbing them briskly to bring the feeling back. "You're really here," he murmured, almost to himself. "I am," I said, my voice trembling, not only from the cold, but from the overwhelming weight of everything. For a moment, we just sat there, the fire cracking between us. I wanted to say something, to explain why I was here, but the words wouldn't come. "You don't know how many times I've thought about this," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many nights I've wondered if I imagined you, if I made the whole thing up." "You didn't," I said. "I'm here. I'm real." He looked up at me then, his eyes bright with something I couldn't quite name. "And you came back." "I didn't know if I would find you," I admitted. "But I had to try." His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb brushing against the cold skin. "You don't have to go back," he said softly. "Not this time." Something inside me broke at those words, some wall I didn't even know I'd built. I leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his hand and his words melt away the years of loneliness. "I don't want to go back," I whispered. And I could never have imagined how quickly familiar I became with this stranger. I knew this guy for 10 minutes in total, but waited for him my whole life. The fire crackled as the heat seeped into my bones. Juan was a constant presence, moving through the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire, fetching thick socks and other clothing items. Finally setting a steaming mug of something in my hands. Hot chocolate, sweet and rich. I couldn't stop watching him. Every movement felt deliberate, calm, and sure, like he'd been living a life of solitude but had found peace in it. He still had that same steady energy I remembered from when we were kids. Back then, it was his voice that pulled me back from the panic of the cold, his warmth that wrapped me up and made me feel safe. And now, 13 years later, here he was, doing it all over again. "How did you find me again?" he asked, sitting down across from me. His voice was curious but cautious, like he was afraid the answer might take me away from him. "I don't know," I admitted, staring into the fire. I couldn't stay in LaBelle anymore. Everything about it felt so empty. And I remembered you. That day. I thought maybe if I went back to the spot where it happened, I'd find something. And I did. Juan nodded slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. "LaBelle?" "Florida," I said. "I'm from Florida." Then I looked around, sheepishly. Where am I? I felt dumb getting the questions out. Wolf Point, Montana. The year is 2000. I traveled through space, not time. I didn't mean to interrupt him. "I always hoped you would," he said. "I always hoped you'd be back." I looked at him. "You did?" "I've been waiting for you." His eyes met mine, unwavering. "I knew I couldn't go through the portal to find you. Not that I didn't try. But I had this feeling, deep down, that someday you'd come back. I just didn't know it would take 13 years. I nodded my understanding. The weight of his words settled over me, a mix of comfort and something more painful. 13 years gone. He'd been wasting away like I had. I tried convincing myself that the whole thing was just some strange fever dream, a memory too weird to be real. But that didn't erase the loss and loneliness which always defined me. "Why?" I asked softly. "Why did you wait?" Juan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the fire. "For the same reason you did. For the same reason you're back. You were the only real thing that ever happened to me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents, they were never around. I was always alone out there. This cabin was theirs, but they were more interested in traveling than raising a kid. I used to spend my nights staring out the window, wishing for someone to talk to, someone to understand me. And then, one day, you appeared. Like a miracle. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "I didn't mean to leave you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Juan said, his tone gentle. "You were just a kid. You had your own life to live. But still, I hoped." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? That I'd spent the last decade trying to scrape by, haunted by memories of snow and a boy who saved me. That I was here now, not because I knew what I was looking for, but because I had nothing left to lose. "I've been alone too," I said finally. "For as long as I can remember. My parents..." I paused, searching for the right words. They weren't the warmest people. Juan's eyes softened. "I'm glad you made it here." "Barely," I said, a shaky laugh escaping me. "I mean, look at me. I showed up naked and half frozen. If you weren't here..." "But I am," he said firmly, cutting me off. "And I don't care that you come naked." The certainty in his voice was like a lifeline, something solid to hold on to. I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tears cooling on my cheeks. I wiped at them hastily, embarrassed, but Juan stood and crossed the room in 2 strides. He said my name softly, crouching in front of me again. His hand found mine, warm and grounding. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself anymore." I wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment and rejection had built walls around my heart, and letting someone in felt as terrifying as stepping through that portal again. "Why me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why are you still here? Still waiting?" Juan's thumb brushed over my knuckles. "Because you're the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't invisible." I couldn't hold back the sob that escaped me. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet breaking of something inside me that I'd been holding together for too long. Juan didn't flinch. He just stayed there, steady and present, letting me fall apart without judgment. When I finally looked up, his eyes searched mine, and for a moment, the space between us felt charged, like something was about to shift. "You don't have to decide anything now," he said softly, "but if you want to stay, there's room here. For both of us." I nodded, the words too heavy to speak. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. The hours passed in a blur of warmth and quiet conversation. Juan had given me a thick sweater and some sweatpants to wear, both of which hung loose on my frame, but wrapped me in a comfort I hadn't felt in years. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of Juan moving about the cabin filled the space with a kind of peace I didn't know I needed. But peace wasn't the same as ease. "How long are you planning to stay?" Juan's voice cut through the quiet, gentle but probing. I hesitated, staring at the fire. "I don't know," I admitted. "I didn't think that far ahead." Juan nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now." That was the thing about Juan. He didn't press, didn't demand explanations or force me into a corner. He gave me space to feel, to think. And yet, the weight of his question lingered in the air. "I've never left home for long," I said after a moment, my voice low. "Even when I was a kid, I always felt like I didn't belong anywhere else." Juan nodded as he just simply listened. Very rare are people who are only willing to listen without giving an opinion. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't offering his home out of pity or obligation. He meant it. But the idea of staying, of being wanted, it scared me more than the thought of leaving. "Why are you so sure about me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Juan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I know what it's like to feel alone," he said simply. "To look around and see nothing but emptiness. And then you showed up, all those years ago. You were scared and cold and lost, but you were real. And you made me feel real too." His words settled over me like a blanket, warm and heavy. I wanted to believe him, but a lifetime of disappointment held me back. "I'm not good at this," I said, the confession tumbling out before I could stop it. "I don't know how to let someone in, to trust that they won't leave." Juan's expression softened, and he moved to sit beside me, the couch dipping under his weight. "You don't have to be good at it," he said gently. "You just have to try." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. What if I mess it up? What if I ruin everything? Juan's hand found mine, his grip warm and steady. "Then we'll start over." The simplicity of his words broke something loose inside me. I'd spent so long convincing myself that I was too broken, too complicated to be worth the effort. But there was Juan, looking at me like I was something worth fighting for. "You make it sound so easy," I said, my voice cracking. "It's not," he admitted, "but nothing worth having ever is." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I could feel the weight of Juan's presence beside me, solid and grounding. "I don't want to be alone anymore," I said finally, the words raw and unguarded. "Me either," Juan said. I turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in his eyes mirrored my own. Slowly, tentatively, I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he wrapped an arm around me, holding me close. The snowstorm eased by Christmas morning, but the world outside remained a blank, frozen canvas. Sunlight glinted off the untouched drifts, dazzling and surreal. It was the kind of beauty that felt both overwhelming and isolating, like standing at the edge of something vast and uncharted. Juan was in the kitchen, humming softly to himself as he prepared breakfast. The smell of coffee and something sweet, cinnamon maybe, wafted through the cabin, wrapping me in a warmth I hadn't realized I needed. I stayed on the couch, wrapped in one of his blankets, watching him move. He was so at ease, so natural in his own space. It was like he belonged to this place, or maybe this place belonged to him. Either way, it was his, and I was just a guest. The thought twisted in my gut. "How do you do it?" I asked suddenly, my voice breaking the quiet. Juan turned, a spatula in one hand and a questioning look in his eyes. "Do what?" "Live out here," I said, gesturing vaguely to the cabin, the snow, the silence. "Alone. Doesn't it ever get too much?" He set the spatula down and leaned against the counter, his gaze thoughtful. "It used to," he admitted. "For a long time, I hated it. The quiet, the isolation, it felt like a punishment, like I was forgotten by the world." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. "But then I realized something," he continued, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "The loneliness didn't come from being out here. It came from not letting anyone in." His words hit me like a slap. "I used to tell myself it was better this way," he said, stepping closer. "Safer. If I didn't let anyone get too close, they couldn't hurt me. But the truth is, I was hurting myself more by shutting people out." He stopped in front of me, his eyes searching mine. "It wasn't until you showed up, first when we were kids, and now, that I realized how much I wanted something different. Someone to share this with." I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "I don't know if I can be that person." "You already are," he said, the certainty in his voice making my chest ache. I shook my head, pulling the blanket tighter around me. "You don't understand. I'm not stable. I don't have anything to offer. I'm just a guy who showed up on your doorstep because I had nowhere else to go. And I'm just a guy who waited 13 years, hoping you'd come back," Juan countered. His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. "I don't need you to be perfect," he said. "I just need you to be here. To try." The simplicity of his request broke something inside me. All my life, I'd been chasing some idea of who I was supposed to be, someone better, someone stronger, someone who had it all figured out. And every time I fell short, I told myself it was proof that I didn't deserve connection, didn't deserve love. But there was Juan, looking at me like I was enough, just as I was. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, sitting beside me. "So am I." His hand found mine, warm and steady. For a moment, I let myself imagine staying here, with him, waking up to sunlight on the snow, to the sound of his voice, to the feeling of being wanted. "I don't know how to do this," I said, the tears threatening to spill over. Juan's fingers tightened around mine. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." And for the first time in years, I believed it might be possible. The day passed slowly, like the world itself wanted to stretch out every moment. The snow outside sparkled under the pale winter sun, untouched and pristine. Juan had insisted on showing me how to chop wood, a task that left my arms sore and my lungs burning from the cold. But there had been something grounding in the rhythm of it, in the way Juan stood close, his hands guiding mine until I got it right. We ate lunch together at the small wooden table by the window. The food was simple: eggs, toast, and leftover coffee, but it felt like a feast. Maybe it was because I wasn't eating alone for the first time in years. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Juan lit candles around the cabin. Their soft glow supplemented the lamps and overhead lights. The fire in the hearth crackled, filling the silence with its warmth. I sat on the couch, my legs tucked under me, while Juan settled into the armchair across from me, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "What's next for you?" he asked, breaking the quiet. The question was simple, but it felt monumental. I thought about it, staring at the flickering flames. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't even know where I'm supposed to go." Juan nodded, as though he understood better than I did. "Maybe you don't have to know right now," he said. His words settled over me like the weight of a blanket, comforting but undeniable. I looked at Juan, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the firelight. "What if I'm not enough?" I asked the question raw and vulnerable. "I don't think we are going to have that problem, but it's a gamble no one has the luxury of knowing." I stared at the floor, doing my best to turn our doubt into surety, but I couldn't do it as well as I wanted to. When I finally looked up, his eyes were soft, filled with something I didn't know how to name but wanted to hold on to. And I knew I didn't have to be sure. There was no certainty. Nothing but the past is promised. I'd spent so long believing that loneliness was my only way, that being alone was safer, easier. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe letting someone in, letting Juan in, was the braver choice. As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, the world felt impossibly small and achingly vast all at once. But for the first time, it didn't feel empty.